In the 1960s, few television characters were as loud, explosive, and unforgettable as Sergeant Vince Carter from Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. Played by Frank Sutton. The character became a symbol of strict military discipline mixed with comedic frustration. Week after week, millions of viewers watched him shout, stomp, and struggle to control the innocent but endlessly troublesome recruit Gomer Pyle. To audiences, Sutton seemed perfectly cast as the red-faced drill instructor who looked like he might burst at any second. His booming voice and intense presence made it easy to believe he was simply playing an exaggerated version of himself. But behind the shouting and the humor was a man shaped by experiences far more serious than any sitcom storyline. Years after the cameras stopped rolling, Sutton would quietly reveal truths about his life that changed how people understood both the character and the man who played him. Long before Hollywood recognized his talent, Sutton had already lived through events that most actors could only pretend to experience. As a young man growing up in Tennessee, he was drawn to the idea of military service. When World War II erupted, he felt the same pull that many young Americans did, a mixture of duty, fear, and determination to prove himself. He initially dreamed of joining the United States Marine Corps, attracted by its reputation for discipline and toughness. However, that dream collapsed in an instant when he failed the color vision test required for enlistment. For a young man eager to serve, the rejection felt devastating. Yet Sutton was not the kind of person to give up easily. Instead of walking away, he enlisted in the United States Army, accepting whatever role he could take in the fight. His assignment sent him to the Pacific Theater, one of the most brutal and unforgiving fronts of the war. There, he participated in 14 separate assault landings, a number that would be overwhelming for any soldier. Each landing meant facing chaos, gunfire, and the terrifying uncertainty of whether he would survive the day. Sutton later received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, honors awarded for bravery and wounds sustained in combat. But unlike many decorated veterans, he rarely spoke about these achievements. For him, they were not symbols of glory, but reminders of fear, exhaustion, and the loss of fellow soldiers who never returned home. The war left marks that could not be seen on the surface, shaping his personality in ways that would later emerge in his acting. When Sutton eventually found his way to acting, those buried memories became an unexpected source of authenticity. He studied drama seriously, eventually attending Columbia University to refine his craft. Acting was not just a career choice. It was a way to channel emotions he could not easily express in ordinary life. On stage and later on television, he discovered that he could transform pain, tension, and discipline into powerful performances. By the time he landed the role of Sergeant Carter, he had already developed a deep understanding of authority, fear, and the complicated emotions that exist beneath a tough exterior. When Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. premiered in 1964 as a spin-off of The Andy Griffith Show, audiences immediately sensed something special. The show paired Sutton's intense drill instructor with the wide-eyed innocence of Gomer Pyle, played by Jim Nabors. The contrast created a comedic dynamic that felt fresh and genuine. Carter's fury collided with Pyle's kindness and confusion, producing moments that were both hilarious and oddly heartfelt. Viewers tuned in not just for the jokes, but for the strange bond that formed between the two characters. The show quickly became a major success, turning Sutton into a household name across America. Yet Sutton's performance was not simply a comedic invention. When asked years later whether his military service influenced his portrayal, he gave a quiet, revealing answer. He remembered what it felt like to be scared and trying not to show it. That insight explained the character's explosive temper in a way audiences had never considered. Sergeant Carter's shouting was not just anger. It was a shield against vulnerability. Sutton understood the instinct to hide fear behind authority because he had lived it. This subtle truth gave his performance a depth that elevated the show beyond simple slapstick comedy. Despite the laughter on screen, the pressure of fame began to build behind the scenes. Sutton approached his work with the seriousness of a stage actor, treating each episode as if it were a theatrical performance. He believed in precision, timing, and emotional honesty. While this dedication contributed to the show's success, it also created tension with the more relaxed atmosphere typical of television comedy. The difference in working styles between Sutton and his co-star Jim Nabors gradually produced distance between them. Though they remained professional, the easy camaraderie that audiences imagined did not always exist off-camera. As the series continued, Sutton found himself increasingly trapped by the very role that had made him famous. Casting directors saw him only as the shouting sergeant, not as a versatile actor capable of subtle or dramatic performances. He began to worry that he would spend the rest of his career repeating the same character. The uniform, once a symbol of success, started to feel like a cage. He longed for opportunities to show different sides of his talent, roles that would allow him to be quiet, thoughtful, or vulnerable instead of constantly furious. This internal struggle remained largely invisible to fans, who continued to see only the fiery Sergeant Carter. To them, Sutton was living a dream: steady work, national fame, and a beloved character. But inside, he wrestled with questions about identity, purpose, and the cost of being defined by a single role. The man who had survived real battlefields now faced a different kind of challenge, fighting to reclaim his individuality in an industry that preferred familiar stereotypes. As the 1960s drew to a close, the future of the show became uncertain. Changes in television trends and the ambitions of its stars signaled that the end was approaching. For Sutton, this moment carried both relief and anxiety. The role had given him everything, yet it had also taken something away. He stood at a crossroads, unsure whether he would be remembered as a talented actor or forever frozen in the public mind as a single character shouting orders at a bewildered recruit. The story of Frank Sutton is not just about a television star. It is about a man shaped by war, fame, and the search for identity. His eventual confessions about the pressures behind the scenes would reveal how complicated success can be. What looked like effortless comedy on the surface was built on layers of discipline, fear, and unspoken memories. And as the next chapter of his life unfolded, those hidden tensions would lead to decisions that surprised everyone, including the network executives who believed they understood him. By the late 1960s, Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. had become one of the most recognizable shows on American television. Its formula seemed simple: the explosive authority of Sergeant Carter colliding with the gentle innocence of Gomer Pyle. But behind the laughter, the daily reality of producing the show was becoming more complicated. Frank Sutton approached every episode with intense focus, believing comedy worked best when treated seriously. He memorized every line, studied every movement, and demanded precision from himself and those around him. To Sutton, the character was not just a caricature. He was a real man shaped by responsibility and pressure. This seriousness sometimes clashed with the lighter, more relaxed style of his co-star Jim Nabors, who preferred spontaneity and warmth over strict rehearsal. Their different approaches did not erupt into open conflict, but they slowly created emotional distance. Nabors' natural kindness and easygoing personality made him beloved by the cast and crew, while Sutton's intensity could feel intimidating. Some interpreted his behavior as moodiness, not realizing he was channeling the discipline he had learned in the Army and on the stage. He believed the show's success depended on maintaining high standards, even if it meant being misunderstood. Over time, their off-screen relationship cooled into polite professionalism. They did their jobs brilliantly in front of the cameras, yet rarely socialized afterward. Fans who imagined them as close friends would have been surprised by the quiet distance between them. As ratings remained strong, the network began thinking about the future. Executives believed Sergeant Carter was popular enough to carry his own series. The idea seemed logical. Remove Gomer Pyle and place Carter in new situations where his fiery personality could continue to drive comedy. For CBS, it looked like a guaranteed hit. They assumed Sutton would be thrilled by the opportunity to headline his own show. Instead, he stunned them by refusing. After years of shouting, sweating under hot studio lights, and being defined by a single character, he was simply exhausted. He feared that another series would lock him permanently into the same role, leaving no room for growth. Sutton's decision confused many people in the industry. Actors rarely turned down leading roles, especially ones backed by a major network. But for him, the issue was not money or fame. It was identity. He wanted to prove he could play more than one kind of character, that he was an actor rather than a living cartoon of anger. The refusal quietly frustrated network executives who had built long-term plans around the assumption that he would agree. In Hollywood, saying no could carry consequences, and Sutton would soon feel them. Meanwhile, Neighbors had his own ambitions. He decided to leave the series in 1969 to pursue music and variety television, areas where his gentle personality and singing talent could shine. CBS launched the Jim Neighbors Hour, giving him a platform that showcased a different side of his abilities. Despite their growing distance, Neighbors invited Sutton to join the new program in a supporting role. Sutton accepted, seeing it as a chance to explore sketch comedy without the burden of carrying a show alone. For a brief moment, it seemed like a fresh start. However, behind the scenes, tensions with the network resurfaced. Some executives were still unhappy that Sutton had rejected the spin-off idea. According to later accounts, pressure was placed on Neighbors to remove Sutton from the variety show. In an industry where loyalty was often secondary to business decisions, Neighbors' response was unusual. He refused. Whatever differences had existed between the two men, he would not betray his co-star. It was a quiet act of respect that spoke volumes about his character. For Sutton, it was a rare reminder that genuine friendships could exist even in Hollywood. Unfortunately, the timing worked against them. Television was undergoing a major shift known as the Rural Purge, during which networks canceled shows they considered outdated or too focused on rural themes. Popular programs like the Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres were abruptly removed from the schedule despite strong ratings. Neighbors' variety show was caught in the same wave and canceled after only one season. Once again, Sutton found himself without a stable television role, facing an industry that still saw him primarily as Sergeant Carter. Typecasting became his greatest obstacle. Casting directors could not separate the actor from the character. Offers that came his way were often variations of the same loud authority figure: military officers, police sergeants, or hot-tempered bosses. Sutton turned down many of these roles, worried they would reinforce the stereotype he was trying to escape. Instead, he returned to theater, where he could take on more complex parts that challenged him emotionally and intellectually. On stage, he rediscovered the quiet satisfaction of performing for an audience that appreciated nuance rather than catchphrases. Yet even in theater, the shadow of Sergeant Carter followed him. Fans who attended performances often waited outside stage doors hoping he would shout his famous lines. Some saluted him as if he were a real drill instructor. While he remained gracious, the encounters were bittersweet. They reminded him that his most famous work was also the thing preventing him from moving forward. Fame, he realized, could be both a gift and a trap. The character that had brought him recognition had also frozen him in time. Privately, Sutton began reflecting on the strange path his life had taken, from war hero to television star to actor searching for new purpose. He had achieved success beyond what he once imagined, yet he felt an emptiness that applause could not fill. Acting had always been his way of understanding the world, but now he wondered whether the industry would ever allow him to evolve. The discipline that had carried him through combat and fame now became a quiet determination to keep working, even if the spotlight had dimmed. As the early 1970s approached, Sutton focused on stage productions and smaller projects, hoping to rebuild his career step by step. He remained respected among fellow actors for his professionalism and dedication, even if the public saw him less frequently. To those who knew him personally, he was thoughtful, humorous, and far gentler than the character that defined him. The contrast between the man and his on-screen persona was striking, a reminder that actors often hide their true selves behind the roles they play. But fate was moving toward a conclusion no one expected. While Sutton continued performing and searching for new opportunities, the physical toll of years of stress and relentless work was quietly building. The man who had survived war and the pressures of fame was approaching a moment that would end his story far too soon. What happened next would shock fans and leave behind a legacy filled with both admiration and unanswered questions. By the early 1970s, Frank Sutton had settled into a quieter phase of his career, far removed from the bright lights and relentless schedule of network television. After years of being recognized everywhere as Sergeant Carter from Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., he found a sense of peace returning to the theater. Stage acting demanded discipline and emotional depth, qualities Sutton possessed in abundance. Unlike television, where scenes were filmed out of order and shaped by editing, theater required actors to live the story from beginning to end each night. For Sutton, it felt honest and grounding. He could finally explore characters who whispered instead of shouted, men who struggled internally rather than exploding outwardly. Audiences in regional theaters welcomed him warmly, not just as a celebrity, but as a serious performer. Many were surprised by how different he seemed from the furious drill instructor they remembered. On stage, he displayed vulnerability, humor, and subtlety. Fellow actors admired his professionalism and kindness, noting that he treated everyone, from lead performers to backstage crew, with respect. The discipline he had learned in the military and refined through years of acting had become part of his character. He arrived early, stayed late, and approached each performance as if it might be his most important one. Despite this renewed sense of purpose, the shadow of his television fame never completely disappeared. In every town he visited, there were fans who came specifically to see Sergeant Carter in person. After performances, some would excitedly ask him to shout the famous lines that had made them laugh years earlier. Sutton usually smiled politely, sometimes obliging with a softened version of the voice that once shook television speakers across America. But those who looked closely could sense a hint of sadness. He appreciated the admiration, yet he also wished to be seen as more than a single character frozen in time. Privately, Sutton began granting occasional interviews in which he reflected on his career with unusual honesty. He spoke about the pressures of fame, the frustration of typecasting, and the difficulty of reinventing oneself in an industry that preferred familiar images. He admitted that he missed being part of something as widely loved as Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., yet he also acknowledged that the show had confined him. The role had been both a blessing and a limitation. For years, he had carried this contradiction quietly, unsure how to explain it to people who saw only success. One of the most revealing aspects of these reflections was his discussion of fear. Sutton confessed that the anger he portrayed on screen often came from a place of vulnerability. Drawing from his wartime experiences, he understood how authority could be used as a shield against uncertainty. The character of Sergeant Carter had resonated with audiences because it contained a hidden truth. Even the loudest voice can be driven by insecurity. By sharing this insight, Sutton allowed fans to see the humanity behind the performance. The shouting drill instructor was no longer just a comedic figure, but a representation of a man trying to control a world that felt unpredictable. As he traveled for stage productions, Sutton also spent more time with his family, reconnecting with the parts of life that fame had pushed aside. He enjoyed simple routines, quiet dinners, conversations without cameras, and the comfort of being known as a husband and father rather than a celebrity. Friends noticed that he seemed calmer and more reflective than in his television years. The relentless pace that once defined his life had slowed, giving him space to think about what truly mattered. Then, in the summer of 1974, Sutton arrived in Shreveport, Louisiana, to perform in a stage play. The production was not a major national event, but a local theatrical engagement, the kind he had come to value. Rehearsals went smoothly, and those working with him later recalled that he appeared energetic and fully committed to the role. There was no sign that anything was wrong. On June 28th, shortly before a scheduled performance, Sutton was backstage preparing when he suddenly collapsed. The cause was a massive heart attack. Despite efforts to save him, he died at the age of just 50. News of his death spread quickly, shocking fans who still associated him with the powerful, unstoppable presence of Sergeant Carter. Tributes poured in from across the entertainment world. Many remembered the laughter he had brought into their homes, replaying clips of his most explosive scenes. Yet in the flood of memories, much of his deeper story remained untold. Headlines focused on the famous character rather than the decorated soldier, the trained stage actor, or the thoughtful man who had struggled to redefine himself. Those who had known Sutton personally tried to share a more complete picture. They spoke of his humility, his dedication to his craft, and his quiet generosity. Fellow veterans remembered his reluctance to discuss his wartime service, interpreting it as a sign of respect for those who had sacrificed more. Theater colleagues described him as a performer who never treated any role as small. To them, he was not just a television icon, but a man who loved acting in all its forms. In the years following his death, reruns of Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. continued to air, introducing new generations to Sergeant Carter's unforgettable outbursts. For many viewers, Sutton remained frozen in that role, eternally shouting at a bewildered recruit. But gradually, stories about his life beyond the show began to surface. Interviews, personal recollections, and archival footage revealed a more complex individual, a war veteran shaped by hardship, an artist seeking authenticity, and a man who had carried both pride and frustration in silence. His passing at such a young age left a sense of unfinished potential. Fans wondered what roles he might have taken if he had lived longer, whether he could have reinvented himself in an era that increasingly valued character actors with depth. The question lingered as part of his legacy, a reminder that some journeys end before their final chapter is written. Frank Sutton's story during these final years was not one of decline, but of quiet determination to remain true to himself. He had stepped away from the easy path of repeating a successful formula and chosen instead the uncertain road of artistic growth. Even though time did not allow him to fully realize that transformation, his efforts revealed a courage different from the kind he displayed on screen. It was the courage to seek identity beyond fame, to be remembered not just as a character, but as a human being. After the death of Frank Sutton in 1974, the world of television moved forward quickly, as it always does. New shows replaced old ones, fresh faces appeared on screens, and the industry continued its relentless cycle. Yet the image of Sergeant Carter from Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. never truly faded. Reruns kept the character alive, allowing new audiences to discover the explosive drill instructor whose temper seemed both terrifying and hilarious at the same time. Children who had never heard of the original broadcast years still laughed at his outbursts, unaware that the man behind the performance had lived a life filled with experiences far more intense than any scripted scene. As time passed, historians of television began to look more closely at the people who had shaped the medium's golden era. Sutton's story emerged as one of the most complex. He was not simply a comedian playing a loud character. He was a decorated veteran who had transformed real fear into believable authority. Scholars pointed out that his performance worked because it contained emotional truth. The character's anger felt genuine because Sutton understood the psychology of command, the pressure of responsibility, and the instinct to hide vulnerability behind discipline. What audiences had once dismissed as exaggerated comedy now appeared as something deeper, a subtle portrayal of a man struggling to maintain control. In resurfaced interviews recorded before his death, Sutton spoke candidly about the cost of being identified so strongly with a single role. He admitted that while he was grateful for the success, he sometimes felt trapped by it. The uniform that had made him famous also limited how people saw him. Casting directors rarely imagined him as anything other than a military authority figure. Even in everyday life, strangers expected him to behave like Sergeant Carter, greeting him with salutes or playful fear. These reactions were meant as compliments, yet they reinforced the sense that his true personality remained invisible. Friends and family later shared stories that revealed a gentler side of the man. Away from the spotlight, he was thoughtful, humorous, and surprisingly soft-spoken. He enjoyed quiet evenings, meaningful conversations, and simple pleasures that had nothing to do with fame. Those closest to him understood that acting had been both his passion and his burden. It allowed him to express emotions he had carried since the war, but it also placed him inside a public image he could never fully escape. Their memories helped balance the narrative, reminding people that behind every iconic character is a human being with private struggles. Over the decades, appreciation for Sutton's work grew rather than diminished. Television critics began citing Sergeant Carter as one of the most memorable supporting characters in sitcom history. The performance influenced later portrayals of authority figures in comedy, proving that even exaggerated roles could contain emotional depth. Actors who followed in his footsteps studied his timing, his physical intensity, and the way he used silence just before an outburst to build tension. Without realizing it, many had learned from his example. Meanwhile, fans who revisited Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. with adult eyes often discovered new layers in the show. What once seemed like simple humor now carried hints of compassion and understanding. Sergeant Carter's frustration was balanced by moments of reluctant affection for Gomer, suggesting a bond that went beyond authority. Knowing Sutton's background as a soldier added another dimension, turning those scenes into reflections of real-life leadership. The struggle to guide someone who sees the world differently while hiding one's own doubts. Sutton's legacy also became a reminder of the hidden costs of fame. His career illustrated how success can both elevate and confine an artist. He had achieved what many actors dream of, a role that would be remembered for generations. Yet that same achievement prevented him from fully exploring the range of his abilities. His story encouraged later performers to seek variety in their work, to avoid becoming trapped by a single image. In this way, his experience helped shape the choices of those who came after him. Today, when classic television channels air episodes of Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., viewers continue to laugh at Sergeant Carter's explosive temper. But for those who know the full story, the laughter carries a touch of respect. They see not just a comedic character, but a man who survived war, navigated the pressures of Hollywood, and searched for identity beyond fame. His life reminds us that public figures often carry unseen burdens, presenting strength to the world while quietly managing their own fears. The story of Frank Sutton endures because it reflects something universal. Many people understand the feeling of being defined by a single role, whether in a career, a family, or society. Like Sutton, they may struggle to show different sides of themselves when others expect consistency. His journey demonstrates the courage required to pursue authenticity, even when it risks misunderstanding. He did not reject his most famous role, but he refused to let it be the only chapter of his life. In the end, Sutton's confession about feeling boxed in by success revealed a truth rarely discussed in the entertainment industry. Fame can magnify a person's achievements while quietly shrinking their sense of self. By speaking honestly about this experience, he offered a perspective that continues to resonate with actors and audiences alike. His legacy is not just the laughter he created, but the humanity he revealed behind it. Though he left the world too soon, Frank Sutton remains part of television history, not only as the unforgettable Sergeant Carter, but as a symbol of dedication, resilience, and the complicated relationship between identity and fame. His story invites viewers to look beyond the surface of entertainment and remember the real lives behind the characters they love. And every time his voice echoes through a rerun, shouting orders at a bewildered recruit, it also carries the memory of a man who gave everything to his craft while quietly searching for himself.